Best laid plans in a trash compactor. Nuisance factor, nuisance factor. Can't get herpes from a tractor. Nuisance factor, nuisance factor. In the way of what you're after. Nuisance factor, nuisance factor, yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh.
Well, hello, Adam Rowe.
Well, hello, Boris
you?
Stop. I'm quite good. In fact, I'm feeling artistically fulfilled right this moment because I'm happy to announce that we just, in a period of not less than 17 minutes, completely composed and recorded the Nuisance Factor theme song, and surprisingly high quality for such a quickly produced effort. But
it was certainly a haphazard effort, but
yes,
it certainly paid off.
I'm very, very happy to have done it. I can't wait to hear it on the tape.
All right, rock and roll.
Rock and roll.
All right, so we're here today, I guess, to continue our conversation from last time, which ran about an hour and 17 minutes.
Correct.
We're going to try to do this within a more reasonable period of time, but I think just kind of picking up where that conversation left off might be appropriate, and we can see kind of where it goes. Where we left off, we were discussing the need for a metaphysic in order to have a morality.
Right.
I do think that there's a lot of things that we were talking about that maybe we needed to discuss a little bit further in depth for folks to have the whole concept of what we're discussing. So I feel like we probably need to correct some of that today, or maybe elaborate on some of that, and then transition to whatever naturally we transition to wherever the conversation takes us. Okay.
Sounds good to me.
All right, very good. So, I think the big thing was some of the few things that I felt were like loose ends from last time was first the atheism versus agnosticism.
Okay.
What do the words mean? How do they apply to what we're talking about, right? So. And this should be a pretty quick discussion, I think.
Yeah, sure.
But essentially, the way I use the term atheist is as a negative position. So my position is that I'm without a belief in God based on the facts currently in evidence. And you would say, well, that's just an agnostic position.
Yes,
that is not typical. That is not atheism. It is agnosticism. Agnostic means without knowledge.
Right.
Gnosticism or gnosis is knowledge, a is without, and so that's really what it means. At one point we had a discussion where I was saying that this is why I prefer the term atheist, because atheist is also a term that starts with the prefix a, as in without, but instead of the suffix being gnosis or knowledge, which seems to be more general, it is specifically a lack of knowledge with respect to a deity, i.e., a theistic
I disagree.
worldview, right? Well, and so what you said
but atheism is the a, of course, the prefix is without, and thea or theses, that is the Greek word for God. So it's not knowledge of God. There's no knowledge in the word atheist. It's simply no God, essentially, if you broke it down and translated it.
Well, but it's the right. Okay, so and you've said also the other argument that I thought was even more compelling is that the term agnosticism has historically been used specifically in the religious context. You don't usually say I'm agnostic with respect to other ideas. You just say, well, I don't know what that is. Agnosticism tends to have a religious connotation. And
sure. Or an anti-religious connotation, if you will, one way or the other.
Well, okay, so agnosticism could have an anti-religious connotation?
Well, I mean, the position of agnosticism is, as far as I can see, the actual answer that reason and reason alone gives when you ask it the question, is there a God? Reason's answer is, I don't know. I don't see any evidence that there's a God, but I also don't see necessarily any compelling evidence that there is no God, and so reason shrugs its shoulders. That's agnosticism, in my opinion, is reason's answer to that question. Mm-hmm. Atheism is actually, in my opinion, something of a metaphysic in the sense that you're saying there is no God, and to make a statement about God, whether it's positive or negative, is still a metaphysical statement. It's something that can't be verified within the physical universe, and so therefore it is, on some level, a statement of metaphysics.
Yeah. So what I've said to you before, though, is I don't know of any atheist that considers himself an atheist in the way you just described, where they're describing some kind of metaphysic. It is always a position, whether it's me or Richard Dawkins, it is always an agnostic position, in effect. It comes from a lack of knowledge. The difference is that you're saying that it's okay for you to speculate about what might be there, and we're saying it's not okay to speculate. That's the difference. So one thing, like you may have heard, right? Dawkins say, we go one God further. Everyone is an atheist, but an atheist in this sense just goes one God further. You are an atheist with respect to, say, the Norse gods, the Greek gods, etc., Allah maybe.
Well,
but
that's not exactly correct, but yeah, I get what you're saying.
Well, yeah. So you can respond and correct me if I'm wrong, of course, on that. But again, the issue is, so from my perspective, I just go one God further. My claim is essentially that there is no evidence that the Greek gods actually exist. There is no evidence that the Norse gods actually exist. You're not allowed to speculate them into existence just because you want an explanation for how the world works, which is how they originated, right? It was essentially, that's where the myths come from. But they started out as legitimate belief systems. The Greeks legitimately believed in the gods of Olympus. And they thought that those gods had a role to play in managing human affairs, etc. They had a legitimate relationship with those gods. So all we're saying is, to us, Christianity is no different from that. It's just a God of the gaps. You're filling the holes with your speculation, and that's the part that we are opposed to. We are not opposed to the notion that if there was evidence for the existence of God, then to embrace the notion that God exists. I don't think any atheist is against that if the evidence were in. So how do you look at those two positions in light of that? So would you say that I'm an agnostic, not an atheist? Would you say that it is inappropriate for me to describe myself as an atheist? Would you say the same about Dawkins then? Because again, Dawkins does not make an affirmative statement that there are no God. Like, he's not looking to prove to you that there is no God. He's saying the burden of proof is on you to prove there is. You're the one making an affirmative statement, so you prove it. But until you prove it, not good enough.
Well, I'm not worried about proving it to Dawkins. I've already proved it to myself, and that's the only really audience that I feel like I owe any actual proof to as far as the question. But with regard to the distinction between the two words, my understanding of atheism is it is an affirmative statement. There is no God. There is no metaphysic. There is nothing beyond our world of phenomena, the world of consciousness, what we can perceive and understand as humans. I understand that position, and I think I could presume or assume, take the risk of assuming, that many people who hold that position would deny that it was a metaphysic in any way, and they would stand up and probably strongly rebuke me and say, no, this is a denial of metaphysic. But I say, when you use your reason as a human being to reach into a realm which cannot be reached by definition, by reason, to deny it, you're still moving into the space of metaphysics and making a metaphysical statement. So I get that that's debatable, but that's how I kind of feel about the question of the definition and meaning of the word atheist or atheism. Agnosticism is, in my opinion, the final answer, the final end game for reason when presented with the question of a metaphysic or presented with the question of a deity. It is, reason just says, I don't know. Probably not, but I don't really know. That's essentially what the data you get back when you view the question through the lens of reason rather than through the other lenses that we spoke about in the previous episode.
Well, yeah, but look, the agnostic position is not merely I don't know. It is a rejection of that reality until it can be proven to exist. Well, so the I don't know is fundamental in the sense that we can't know what we don't know. And you have no excuse for imagining that which we do not know. That's really the conflict between
I have no excuse for imagining, huh?
And belief. Well, good. You don't have you can't justify it rationally.
I've never tried to.
Right. I understand.
And I've said that, in fact, that the entire spiritual process is anti-rational. In fact, it's a vehicle by which the human mind overcomes reason and transcends reason. That is the strength of it. That's where its power for the individual, at least for this individual, lies.
Right. So, to me, that just sounds like, no offense, but I'm not able to connect the dots there. Like there's just some of the things that you're saying just don't add up. Like, okay, well, what evidence do you have that this thing exists? You have no evidence.
I have the evidence of my own existence and the important role that it plays, and that's evidence enough for me.
Okay. Well, so then when you say that I have evidence, then now you're back into trying to justify it rationally.
No, I'm justifying it existentially. I'm saying the role that it plays in my existence as a human being is so profound and so overarching and so indispensable that for me, that is, I mean, that's all I need to believe it. Okay.
But so far, the only here. Okay, let me.
So that's not a rational argument. That's an existential argument, maybe. I mean, I guess that's debatable too. One other thing, though. Mm-hmm. Your statement, agnosticism, is not just a shrug of the shoulders at the question by reason, but it includes this sort of burden of proof, legalistic, component. Well, I mean, it's fine for you to say that, but we're talking about a single word, agnostic. There's nothing in there about any standards of proof or burdens of proof or rules of procedure or any kind of... It contains nothing of that. It is an answer to a single question. Is there a God or not? And the answer that reason gives is, I don't know. And that's what agnosticism is. That's what the word means.
Yeah. So I
mean, you're welcome to add more too, but none of that other stuff is contained in that word, is what I'm saying.
That's all fair. I mean, we're talking about loaded words. Like, again,
sure.
Atheism, you could say that it is a position that is, that acknowledges the lack of God, but not an affirmative position that declares there are necessarily no gods.
I don't agree with that. I mean, as a matter of syntax in the Greek and English language, that's not what it means. It's a statement, no God. That's like, if you broke it down to its most simple elements, it literally means no God. That is an affirmative statement that there is no God. Now, a lot of people who hold atheism to be true would say, well, that doesn't mean it has anything to do with God, or I'm projecting into metaphysics. That's fine. They can frame their arguments, and I can frame mine. I say when you make a statement affirmatively about God, whether to deny him or whatever, rejoice in him, affirm him, you've still crossed the bounds from the world of phenomena into the world of metaphysics.
All right. So I think it probably does come down to this issue of proof and how much proof you require versus how much proof I require, and what nature that proof has to assume. So, like, for example, I was making a big deal about coherence, right? Mm-hmm. To me, the statement that, well, this is true for me and I don't have to prove it to you, right, mm-hmm. is anti. It's
not that I don't have to prove it to you. It's that I cannot prove it to you. It can't be demonstrated rationally. That's a given. I've admitted that from the beginning.
But would you agree then that makes the belief incoherent?
No,
it does not.
Absolutely, I would not.
It makes it incommunicable.
I think it's been communicated from generation to generation of human beings down the 5,000 years of human history.
Through war and bloodshed, through literally a history of misunderstanding on that very ground of nonsensical concepts, with different people interpreting nonsense differently and then going to war over it. That's literally the history of mankind. It has never been communicated
effectively. You said it couldn't be communicated. I said, well, these religions last for thousands and thousands of years and they come down generation to generation to generation. There must be some sort of communication. Maybe it's biological communication. Maybe it's something that's inherited. Maybe there's a genetic predisposition to these ideas. But even that is still communication, is it not? It's just a different kind of human communication,
But if I asked you what ideas are being conveyed, the only idea that you could say is being conveyed is the notion that something exists outside of our immediate ability to perceive.
No, the notion being conveyed is that there is a but-for cause for all of these chains of cause and effect that permeate the universe. And that but-for cause, that fount of being, that kernel of knowledge is what we reduce to the word God in the English language, and many other religions have other words for it. And I wanted to touch on something else. It was So you had said something about, you don't believe in the Norse gods and you don't believe in the Greek gods. Well, let's talk about another two words that we discussed last time that a lot of people maybe don't have don't hear in their everyday conversations. It's exoteric and esoteric. Okay, so exoteric, right? Exoteric, the external forms of religion, these are essentially what we would probably, most people in 2024 would say, this is what we call organized religion. So the exoteric forms of religion are like the Catholic Church, the Shiite Muslims, the, whatever, Southern Theravada Buddhists, the Episcopalians, the Baptists, whoever. So these are really political organizations, but they preserve these religious sort of rituals and symbols and ideas, and these are sort of what's fed to the masses as religion and also fed to the masses as a base of political power. So that's exoteric. And exoterically, I practice Episcopalian Christianity, and so on the exoteric level, of course, I don't believe in the Norse gods or Buddha or anything like that, because that's not the religion that I found myself born into in this life. Now, let's distinguish the exoteric from the esoteric. The esoteric form of religion, that is the inner, subjective, the ego's struggle to find God, to make connection with the ultimate, to transcend reality through a spiritual process, okay? And when we look at these questions on the esoteric level, okay, the esoteric is the quest to find Zen, man. It's it's the moment you want to find the Holy Grail. It's the individual. It's subjective. Okay, from an esoteric perspective, or looking at it through the esoteric lens, of course I believe in the Norse gods and the Greek gods and in Buddha and Muslims and everything else. Islam and everything else. I didn't mean to use the wrong word there. Mm-hmm. I apologize for that. So esoterically, I think that all of these exoteric religions boil down to essentially the same set of ideas being presented through different linguistic approaches and different narratives. But I think they very strongly, to me, merge into one tapestry and have one point, and that point is that there is, in fact, a power. There's a first mover. There's a ultimate source of being for this entire universe, and I call that God.
So the distinction between the exoteric and the esoteric seems to me to be the difference between religion and psychology. And I think you would agree with that. You would say that, look, psychologically, we clearly have a longing for truth, right? Sure. And I would agree with that 100%. And in fact, I pointed that out in the first episode. It almost seems palpable to me that there's something outside of my immediate Dasein, right? But that's different. Again, I feel like that's very different from saying that you have faith. I think that's different from faith. Like your psychological phenomena, for example, are facts and evidence. These are things that we can say, like, look, and clinical psychologists can tell you.
Is faith not a psychological phenomenon?
Well, if it is, then it's not quite faith, right? Because you made that distinction before.
Is there anything in this perceivable universe that cannot be characterized or at least viewed as a psychological phenomenon?
Right, but what does that do to your argument, right? Because if your argument is that faith is the opposite of reason,
it is,
right? But isn't psychology a science? Isn't it a practice that takes into account data sets and then analyzes those data sets and then based on the data sets forms theories? Yes, right?
The answer is yes and no. Psychology, as it has evolved from I guess it really kicked in strongly in the late 19th century, and as it's come down to us, actually has always held itself out as a science, whether we're talking about the psychoanalysts or the folks that came before Freud and Jung, or whether we're talking about the moderns and Kinsey and Maslow and whoever. Okay, it's always held itself out as a science. The other scientists in the sciencey world, who make it to be their job to critique their fellow scientists, have often and almost universally criticized a great deal of what we consider psychological literature and psychological thinking and writing for the very fact that it is not a science. It can't be quantified. You can't control it. You can't experiment against it. You can't form hypotheses that have any reasonable way of being tested, because what you're talking about in psychoanalysis, for example, is inner workings of the mind, which can't be controlled, which can't be measured, which can only really be perceived subjectively by individuals and then sort of projected onto mankind as a whole. Now, there is one school of psychology that started pretty much with Skinner. Really, no, it started with Pavlov, and then Skinner became like the big figurehead of behavioral psychology. And behavioral psychology reduces psychology to human behavior. It doesn't really like necessarily acknowledge a difference between psychology and behavior. And the advantage to this approach, while there are many disadvantages, including that it makes man into some kind of automaton, but the advantage to this approach is you can actually design experiments and get data and control. And the behavioralists have actually developed a large set of psychological data, which is fairly profound, and some of it is quite shocking when you consider the implications of it. But no, I would say that like what we consider classical psychology, classical psychoanalysis, that's closer to poetry than it is really to anything that resembles science.
All right. Well, so what do you make of? And yes, there are the behaviorists,
right?
But then are you saying that literally anything outside of behaviorism does not qualify as a science?
Well, there's other, areas that I have very, very little actual technical knowledge of. Things like, neuropathy, the folks that study the way the brain looks under different circumstances. I think that there's a lot of objective scientific data that can be deduced from that approach. I don't know who the leaders of that field are. I'm not up on that literature, so I can't really comment intelligently on where that is. But there are disciplines in psychology which can be considered strictly science. The most famous one, the one that I personally know the most about, is behavioral psychology.
So if you acid trips or DMT trips, right? People describe having very similar experiences.
Right.
So you could sit down with somebody that's a psychologist, say, and describe your DMT trip, and person B could do the same thing, and your accounts will be similar. That is data. That is data upon which a scientific theory can validly be formed or based.
Well, it's data, but how do you control against that?
Well, you control against that with the population that has not encountered these phenomena. Perhaps you control against it with the population that took DMT but did not have those experiences, which I'm not sure that such a population even exists. It seems to me that the evidence that experience is common to people when DMT increases in your brain, right, because it already exists naturally in you, there is evidence that we have a similar experience. Again, that's data, and that could form the basis of a hypothesis.
Well, the psychoanalysts, I'm sorry, my tongue's not working. The psychoanalysts and their acolytes and the folks that came after them, and all the psychologists that deal in the strictly subjective sort of understanding of thought and the human mind, they definitely put that argument forward, and they strongly get up, in their bully pulpit, and they argue that this is in fact objective science. The problem is that how can you have objective data about psychological phenomenon that only exists within an individual's mind? How can you really objectively measure that? You really can't. But what you can objectively measure is behavior. You can measure how many times, if you put a pigeon in a box and put a button in there, and every 10th time the pigeon pecks the button, it gets a little injection of cocaine into its brain, and then you stop the cocaine administration, you can actually objectively measure how many times that pigeon hits the button before he gives up. That's objective data. I don't see how you can have objective data about, somebody's internal feelings, internal longings, internal questions, internal dialogue, ego, superego, all of this, the id. I don't know how it can be objectively measured. Some people say it can. I'm skeptical.
Well, why wouldn't it be measured in the same way that behaviorists measure data? Well, it is the same way. It's just a fledgling science. It's not quite as advanced. They'll develop their methodologies with time, But
Well, they've been developing them for a long time, and they've never been able to. This is all a huge debate, and I'm not a scientist, by the way.
Well, again, I'm not trying to make assertions beyond what exists currently in the current debate. What I'm saying is that obviously, right? The reason it's important, I think, to take into account, acid trip or what's the word I'm looking for? Hallucinogenic experiences,
psychedelic experiences.
Yeah, because they do give us an idea of what's going on objectively, because we can cross-correlate between the experiences of multiple individuals. If you think about it, that's how science was done before we had better instruments. How did we know that it was that the sun would rise tomorrow, for example, right? We didn't know that the sun was a star. We didn't know what the relationship of the earth to the sun was. Yet we were able to tell that the sun would rise tomorrow because it repeatedly did. Because that is evidence of future action, future behavior, in spite of how Hume wants to approach that issue. So why would that not be sufficient now, right? Again, it's a science that's still developing. They will develop controls. There's no reason to think they wouldn't. And what they have is right now a cross-correlation among multiple people having the same experience under the same circumstances. That is data. That is scientific data. People can say it's not, but they would be deceiving themselves, obviously. When you have more than one similar experience, that is information, scientific information that needs to be taken into account.
Well, the problem is that you're depending for scientific, precise, sort of numerical, rational, which you usually demand data, upon a situation that appears to me to be: you have person A has taken LSD, person A has reduced his LSD experience to the best approximation of language which he can, which is going to be different for every person. And then person B has done the same, and then scientist C has used his best understanding of language to interpret these two sets of languages describing a mental state to try to arrive at some objective data. And the fact is that while that's, you can reduce that and you can analyze that, it's not objective. It's always a subjective question in psychology and speculative psychology and psychoanalysis, etc. So, there's a large portion of the scientific community. It's my understanding. Once again, let me reiterate for the folks anybody that listens to this: I'm not a scientist, and I do not go home and read the academic psychology journals. But I don't see how that can be viewed as objective or scientific in any classically scientific experimental sense. I don't see how you control against a subjective experience in one individual's consciousness versus the other. But I do see how you can control in measuring behavior, because it's literally, we can all see the penguin peck the button 267 times before it gives up because it doesn't get cocaine anymore.
What I'm saying is it's much easier to see what's going on in behaviorist data than it is to see what's going on with data involving DMT use.
Right.
But that's just a matter of degrees, and it's a matter of the fact that behaviorism is much older in psychology than analysis of people using psychedelics, because there's been a stigma associated with psychedelic use for a long time. It's been suppressed. People had to, if they wanted to do research on psychedelics, they'd have to do it at their own risk. My point with all of this is that I am not averse to accepting even dubious scientific data. I'm not. I'm happy to listen to those psychologists that claim they have some theory that they've arrived at on the basis of interviewing multiple people having similar experiences during a DMT trip.
Right.
So but note the difference between you and me on this issue. You're saying, well, look, behaviorists come at you with real data, and these people, not quite. And I'm saying, well, maybe so, but it's still acceptable to me. Even that level of evidence would be acceptable to me if you were to present it with respect to the existence of God. I would say, okay, multiple people who are otherwise unmotivated have had a similar experience okay, and you can test that for bias, and you can you can derive some data from that, then I would say, okay, there's something maybe to it.
Do you hear what you're saying? You're defeating your own argument. You realize that, right?
Well, I would be.
I said wait. I said that like my subjective experience of spirituality is enough data for me, and you just said, well, if only multiple people were having the same experience, then we would have data and it could be scientific. And I will point out to you who knows how many, eons of people who have believed in religion and had similar experiences as a matter of religion. But you say that's not data for purposes of religion, but it is data for purposes of psychoanalysis. Let me make one more point real quick. I'm not saying that I don't find the work of the psychoanalysis, Freud, Jung, etc., Lacan, or the folks that came after them. I'm not saying it's not valuable. The fact that it's not objectively scientific in no way diminishes its value to me. I think it's extremely important as a philosophy, as poetry, as a set of ideas which seem to correlate very strongly to what I experience within my own mind.
Right, and I'm not saying you deny that. Obviously, you have a greater tolerance for a lack of evidence. Again, no offense, but just with respect to your belief system.
Well, I don't put reason on a throne like you do. You put reason on a throne. I put reason at a table with some other things.
So here's the distinction between the data set that we have with respect to people who have experienced a DMT trip and versus the data set that we have with respect to people who've experienced religious faith, whatever, is that latter set does not actually offer anything coherent because look.
But a DMT trip does.
Yes, because the DMT trip has one thing in common. For example, just out of the gate, you can see it. And that is that all of those people took a physical drug with the same components in it. And so you could expect a similar result. With religious experience, you could have people saying, no, this is what I believe about the nature of the universe, and it can be completely different from what you describe, and yet the experience seems to be the same. Well, that's way more dubious than the data we have pertaining to a DMT trip. So I don't think that this is me getting in the weeds, by the way, because I have a very specific standard that I offer for you to have a legitimate claim, and that is coherence. You have to be able to make a coherent argument, and an argument that says, well, that's just my experience, that's what I dealt with, and I don't have to prove it to you, that lacks coherence. Good for you, I could say. Great for Adam. I'll pat you on the back. You have found God, whatever.
I mean, I'm not sure, bro, but I never set out my mission to convince anyone else of any set of beliefs or experiences. But the fact is that there are millions upon millions upon millions upon millions of people going back as far as the record of human history goes that have felt similar, have held similar views to myself when it comes to the belief in the existence of God. And that's a fact, and that's an objective fact. And, you can say it's incoherent. Well, I will say, well, I'm only going to point to the historical record and say, well, a lot of people didn't feel that way.
Well, again, for it to be coherent, you should be able to explain it to me now.
I have explained it to you.
Well, you've explained to me that you have a belief and you have an entitlement to the belief. You have not, but in fact, when it came to explaining it to me, you said, I don't know you an explanation because it's esoteric. It is my personal...
Well, I've said it's not explainable. It can't be, you can't reason your way to God. That's a given.
Exactly. You've already conceded the point. It doesn't have to cohere.
But but just because you can't reason your way to God doesn't mean you can't find your way to God in other ways. That's what I'm saying. And you say, well, that's incoherent. Well, that's fine. It is incoherent for you, but it's not for me. I can reach God through emotion. I can reach God through art. I can reach God through music. I can reach God through my children. I don't necessarily need reason. Reason is not the only path for me to spirituality or to any form of knowledge for that matter.
So but note what you said. It's coherent to me. Well, if it's coherent to you, again, good for you. But coherence, the way I'm using it, is communicability. It has to be communicable.
I could communicate it to you emotionally. I could communicate it to you with a piece of music or a work of art, but you got to have ears to hear, man.
Well, you would have to, but again, like here's the thing though. I can also speculate about what exists outside of Dasein.
Okay.
I can also do that. Right? Anybody can.
Sure.
In fact, I do. I do speculate.
Clearly. We're sitting here talking about it for another hour-long session.
Do I have a hope? Yeah. Well, I actually kind of want to address that too, because this notion that that an atheist who talks about God incessantly is obsessed with God, God is not a thing that you've defined. God is not an actual creature. He's not an actual thing.
Well, so why are we talking about it?
Because you've thrown out this concept that stumps everybody because you feel like you don't have to account for it. You can just believe in it. You can just say this thing exists.
I've accounted for it as best I can, man. I never said that I could prove it to you rationally. In fact, I said that no one can prove it rationally, and I've also said that the fact that it can't be proven rationally and the fact that faith requires one to go beyond reason to find a new source of knowledge is what gives faith its strength and meaning to the faithful. That's the best demonstration that I am capable of. Maybe there's somebody who's better. You cannot reason your way to God. You just can't. It can't be done. I'm sorry that that's the condition of the humanity and the condition of the universe, but there's nothing I can do about it.
But I can say the same thing then. I can say that if you can't reason your way to God, he doesn't exist. He may exist for you, but you're deluding yourself. And you may feel like you don't have to explain yourself to me, but all you're saying is that you don't care about the other humans in your life.
You're making reason the criterion of existence, and I don't agree with that. I don't think that that's correct at all. You're saying that if I can't reason my way to it, it doesn't exist. Well, I think that's categorically wrong, and I don't agree with it.
And the reason you don't agree with it is because you feel that every individual is like an island to himself and can have his own belief systems and can feel the way he wants, which is true. That is true. And he owes nothing to his fellow man by way of an explanation. So if you've convinced yourself of anything, you're entitled to those thoughts.
What do I owe to anybody, man?
I think we all owe each other a duty. And I think that with my reading of Heidegger, my strong feeling that we all owe a duty to one another, a duty of explanation, a duty of care. We do owe that, and I think it's increased since I've read Heidegger at your instruction.
Well, if I owe you an explanation, a rational explanation per se from your perspective, and I say to you, I can't give you a rational explanation. What do you want me to do? Kill myself? Put me up on the cross? I mean, what is the problem, man? I told you that I can explain it emotionally. I can explain it artistically. I can explain it. I believe that it can be reached and communicated through many ways. I think it's communicated genetically amongst human beings as the generations pass down. But it can't be reasoned its way to. So the question is reason the only criterion of existence? If I can't reason it, then it doesn't exist? You say, I think, yes. I say definitively no.
Okay. So that's very interesting because it comes... Okay, so don't you think this comes down to this issue that I've struggled with very much, which is the what has primacy, consciousness or existence?
Okay.
So for you, what has primacy?
What do you define primacy for me?
Primacy. So what comes first? Did existence exist, or did consciousness exist? And existence springs into existence with consciousness, or existence exists regardless of whether it can be perceived. This is the classic George Berkeley question.
You're asking,
if a tree falls in the woods,
you're asking which comes first, the chicken or the egg? And first of all, I mean, reason's answer is once again agnostic. Reason doesn't know. Okay, I can't conceive of human existence without human consciousness because what else is there for me? What other frame of reference do I have to make that distinction? Exactly. So, I can't imagine a combination of existence that exists but without human consciousness. I can't go outside of my head and do that. So what I think that question does is just sort of rubs you right up against the line between existence and thinking, which is one of the horizons, which maybe we should discuss and explain a little bit better for the folks who probably aren't so read in Heidegger. But, so I think what you're really doing is pushing me up to the limit between being and thinking with that question. And the answer reason gives is I don't know, and I don't have any other answer to give you.
Right, but again, if you're saying I don't owe you a coherent explanation, but you feel that
I don't owe
consciousness...
anybody any explanation for my personal views.
No, I understand that, but I don't really necessarily think you feel that way, but that's maybe that conversation for another day. Because why else would you be doing this podcast except to humor me?
I'm doing this podcast because I'm your friend and I like talking to you.
I like talking to you too, but you also hopefully acknowledge that you have a lot of things rattling around in your head that other people have to hear. Well, they do.
I do, but I mean, if the next step in that analysis is for me to rationally demonstrate that God exists, well, guess what? I can't do it.
But don't you think you just contradicted yourself? Because when you say that, but if you say that consciousness has primacy over existence, which is my big departure from Rand. I didn't say that.
I said I don't know.
Okay, but I do know,
okay.
Or at least I have a very strong feeling that that's the case. Why? Because Heidegger made very, very compelling arguments to that effect. And this is something where I had to struggle within myself because Rand certainly doesn't accept that. Rand believes in the primacy of existence over consciousness. And my question to her would be, how do you know? Which is your question to her as well. But if that's the case, then think about the importance of coherence, of communicability. Because if we can't know enough to be able to convey these ideas to each other coherently, then what are we even talking about? We're talking about nothing.
Okay, when you use the word communication, you are strictly limiting that to verbal communication in some sort of language system or linguistic structure. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, well, I don't agree that that's the only way for human beings to communicate.
That's the primary way for us to communicate, certainly with strangers.
There's many other ways for human beings to communicate.
How else would
human
you
beings
communicate
through art, they communicate through body language, they communicate through the various chemicals that their bodies produce and the effects that they have on each other. They communicate genetically as they pass their genes down through the generations. They communicate through music. Human beings communicate in a myriad of ways, one of which is linguistic communication. And the fact that I can't use reason and the sort of the operation of language to demonstrate to you that 1 + 1 + 5 = God is real does not mean it can't be communicated, because there's other ways to communicate things. And I believe that this information, this idea, this set of values, if you will, has been communicated to me from my parents, and it was communicated to them from their parents, and I believe it's passed down. I believe it's passed down through art, through culture, through values, through music, through genetics. I think it's communicated many ways, and I think there are many more ways to communicate than simply speaking or reasoning in language.
So then, how do you explain then the all the wars that have been fought on disagreements based on? So understand my perspective here, right? So you're saying, look, I don't have to explain this to you verbally. I don't have to explain this to you rationally. There are many ways in which
It's not that I don't have to. It's that I simply cannot, Boris, for the millionth time. I can't explain it to you
right,
rationally.
But then the second...
Nobody can.
But
there's never been a person who could.
There is a way to communicate it.
Okay.
And the way to communicate it is through music, through poetry, through all of these other means that human beings
through art, through
have
genetics,
a connection
through
each
body
other,
language, through sexuality, through chemistry, through... we could make a list 20 pages long probably if we tried. Human beings communicate in a myriad of ways. All animals do. All creatures, all biological entities do. Many of whom do not possess the ability to use language.
But again, how does that translate to the fundamental disagreements about religion? That, to a person who operates on a cerebral level, right, who's not trying to necessarily open things up as broadly as you, which I may be mistaken in doing that, okay? But at the same time, I communicate cerebrally. So what is there anything that you can offer me as far as evidence of the validity of your position? Anything?
My position that God exists and is real.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I've given you everything I got, buddy, about a dozen times,
Okay.
including in this show and the previous
Right,
show.
but you're by your own admission, you're unable to communicate these things to me rationally.
Correct.
Therefore, you're not really able to communicate them to me based on my standard. You're saying I can communicate these things to you via all these other ways that are available to mankind to communicate with each other. But Mike, doesn't this beg the question of the fact that human beings have not been on the same page about religion throughout human history? So if it's this intuitive thing where we all have a certain understanding about what's going on intuitively that we can communicate to each other through poetry. We don't have to go beyond poetry. We know what poetry is. Poetry is the use of language in a less coherent manner than statements of fact. Okay,
poetry
fine.
is the use of language artistically to convey emotion. That's what poetry is. Poetry is the attempt to use language and music, because poetry and music are, inseparable on the highest level, to convey emotions, to convey feelings, to convey faith, to convey spirituality, to convey things that simply cannot be conveyed in words. I think that is maybe the sine qua non of poetry and the sine qua non of music, is there are things that need to be conveyed that we cannot express in words. Words have limitations. Language has limitations. And, music and art also have limitations, but they also open areas of communication that maybe are not so open in the world of linguistics, right?
But again,
but if you're going to say the only way that you could prove, the only way that I could believe in God is if you could demonstrate some kind of equation that proves it, well, I can tell you unequivocally. I mean, you don't need me to tell you this. It's obvious. It can't be done. Okay? It cannot be done. I can't change that.
But if that's the case,
I don't owe you some kind of superhuman ability to say 5 + 5 - 10 = God is real. I don't.
You don't owe me that because that doesn't exist.
Because nobody owes you that because it doesn't exist.
But in terms of conveying, how do you explain the fact that the differences in religion are what's driving the wars in the world today? The reason people are dying, children are suffering, is because of differences between religion. Why? Because there is no coherent way for people from different religious camps to communicate with each other. That's my point.
That's really not true. What it is. Let's go back to this distinction, this very, very critical distinction between the esoteric form of religion and the exoteric form of religion. When you see wars, whether you're talking about the wars of the Middle Ages, the Protestant Catholic wars, or whether you're talking about modern wars between Islam and Israel or whatever, what you're seeing is conflict in the arena of exoteric religion. And I have defined exoteric religion as organized religion, or really political institution with a religious facade. And that is the source of the wars. People are not having wars over esoteric experiences. Zen monks are not invading the desert fathers in Egypt and trying to murder them over their personal spiritual disciplines and attempts to seek God. The religious wars are caused and are between political entities, which are very much a component of exoteric religion, which is really not entirely different from just simply political power.
But the thing is, though, that applies maybe on some kind of superficial level with respect to, say, the Crusades, but that doesn't. How does that move the needle for the individual crusader?
Well, why don't give me one example of people having a war over the esoteric aspects of religion. I would like to hear this, please.
I think fundamentally it is all a war about esoteric forms of religion. Why? Because the motivation superficially may be exoteric, they may be political, etc. But the reason why a crusader, an individual person, takes up his sword and goes to the Holy Land to fight for Constantinople or whatever, is because of his esoteric convictions.
So he would have gone to Constantinople even if
not necessarily.
even if William the Lionheart hadn't organized the biggest army in the history of Middle Ages Europe, and the Pope backed him and demanded him to go. No, of course he wouldn't have gone.
But he also wouldn't have gone
because it's a matter of exoteric religion. It's a political question.
But it also
not a thematically religious question or metaphysical question.
But he also wouldn't have gone religion if he didn't have the esoteric, his esoteric understanding of religion driving him to participate in the exoteric war that's coming.
The fact that the Brahmin class can
That's probably a weird way of using those terms, by the way.
The fact that the Brahmin class can use its political power to direct and exploit the personal feelings of their acolytes and Ararats and whoever's under them for purposes of politics and for purposes of war, in no way changes the fact that these wars are political, and while they are framed very often, especially in the past, not so much anymore, although there are some, in terms of religion, that framework is in my opinion, expression of the esoteric aspect of religion, and I don't believe fundamentally that there's ever been a war between men over their personal pursuit of enlightenment, their personal pursuit of God, their personal pursuit of Satori, their personal pursuit of Brahman. I don't think that has ever happened. I'm not aware of any examples of that.
Reason, but what I'm saying is that
there's politics and religion, man, and the political religion is the exoteric religion. It's just part of it. It's never going to change. I can't change that, but it doesn't alleviate or in any way diminish the thirst, the need, the drive within the human mind, within the human genome, to make contact with something outside, with something beyond, with the cause, with the source of being, man.
I don't disagree with that latter part. That's a different question. Let me address, because I want to address sort of the first issue. So, okay, the exoteric, I keep saying exoteric reasons or exoteric religion is a reason maybe for is a superficial reason for the conflict. But again, my point is that the reason the individual crusader fights with fervor for the political whatever that exists in the exoteric realm or whatever is because of his esoteric connection with whatever it is that you're describing. He feels a kinship to you. In fact, I can't recall the name of the scholar, but there's somebody that that's pretty reputable that makes the argument that in the especially in the Middle Ages, right? The way that you could tell whether somebody was human or not was based on their religious affiliation. Like, it was inconceivable to a normal person during the Middle Ages that a person who did not believe in the Christian God, in Christ, had a soul. A person who did not believe in Christ did not have a soul. It was not a matter of, they weren't even human to them. The Moors, the Arabs, they weren't even human. They did not qualify as human because to be human, you had to be a Christian. We've deviated from that concept. And
who is this person that's saying this?
This was a recent, I think it was John Vervaeke, I believe, who's actually quite brilliant. I've mentioned him before to you. I may be wrong about that. Maybe some other individual, but I'll dig that up and I'll send it to you. My point is that a lot of scholars will characterize it that way. They'll say that, look, there was a crisis of faith in the West that occurred essentially with Nietzsche. Well, not with Nietzsche. Prior to Nietzsche, Nietzsche identified it. When Nietzsche said God is dead, what he meant essentially is that there was a shift in culture from God being not just alive, but centrally alive, as in defining our very being, to being less relevant in the culture. More people became atheistic. More people became, some obscure version of Christianity, and so we lost our identity as a culture. God had died, and then that ushered in the Enlightenment with all of its consequences.
Look, man, the prince will always exploit his people's emotions, his people's feelings, his people's wants, his people's needs. The prince will always use whatever means are at his disposal to formulate for himself the most powerful army, the most devoted army, the most zealous army, the army that's willing to die for him. And the prince can use the exoteric forms of religion or, odes to patriotism or, a million other ways that these politicians and propagandists have to cajole men into fighting what are essentially senseless, bloody wars, and that's the better part of all of human history. That, to me, has no bearing on the question of whether an individual is justified or even needs to be justified, or whether justification even has any relevance to that individual's relationship to the ultimate reality and to the metaphysic to which he prescribes himself.
But my point is not that necessarily. My point is that the coherence point. Mm-hmm. The coherence point is that you saying that esoteric forms of faith exist and are important and are real, and this is something that is worth our time. Well, isn't that belied by the whole of history, where it didn't amount to stopping wars, it didn't amount to stopping suffering, it didn't amount to anything great. It just amounted to death,
Give me some examples of atheism stopping wars or stopping famines or stopping...
Atheism is a negative position, though. That's the difference.
Okay, I'm just saying. You say, well, religion has never stopped all these horrible things. Well, neither has atheism.
Well,
right?
I'm not advocating for atheism as a state religion. What I'm saying is atheism is the natural and healthy default position. Okay, but again, there's even a dispute about how I'm using that term. So why don't we just say agnosticism? I feel that agnosticism is the natural, healthy position, and that any kind of attempt to say that something exists outside of what is communicable is not legitimate. It's not a legitimate thing that we should
because reason is for you the criterion of legitimacy, but reason for me is not the criterion of legitimacy.
But remember, what we're trying to accomplish is a practical thing. We're trying to accomplish. What we're trying to do is figure out what is the guide to human action. That is the underlying thing of this conversation. Is we want to know, how ought humans live? How should we act?
Is it possible that there's more than one way we ought to act, that some of us may have a temperament that we should act according to spiritual lines, as I've tried to describe, and others should have a temperament where they ought to act according to absolutely rational lines and atheistic lines and agnostic lines have you described? Is it possible that there's more than one right path for any given individual person?
Yes, it's possible, but
I personally think it's likely.
But don't you think
how could you possibly demonstrate it? I mean, I can demonstrate it by pointing to all the Christians who seem to have lived more or less happy lives or more or less successful lives and died more or less, peacefully. And you could point to all the atheists who've done the same. What does it matter?
Well, what matters is that with reason, we have coherence, and outside of reason, we have nothing. Mm-hmm. We have mumbo jumbo. Mm-hmm. And again, that is not to diminish your personal feelings.
So emotions are mumbo jumbo?
Yes, they can be.
Okay, well, I categorically disagree.
Hold on. Remember what I said about emotions before, and this was not in this podcast, so it's not fair for me to say remember, but emotions inform your values.
Okay.
Emotions inform your values. They are the variables upon which you make affirmative, rational statements. So, for example, the way I feel about you.
So they're not mumbo jumbo then, because they inform your values. Is that what you're saying?
They have to be made sense of.
Are they mumbo jumbo or not, sir?
Well, yeah. So here's the thing: rational values are not mumbo jumbo. Irrational values are mumbo jumbo. Okay. People have both. Okay. And that is the challenge of a rational person, or a person who tries to live rationally, is you have to parse those out. For example, heroin, that is a value. You can't argue that it's not. It certainly is. It has a beneficial effect of pleasure. That is a value. But is it a rational value? For most people, it is not, because it compromises their ultimate value, which is their life. Without life, you can't enjoy heroin, you can't love your wife. You have to do a balancing act. That's what Rand calls for. That's why I have such respect for her. That's all she is in a nutshell.
Every time I want to shoot heroin, I need to get out my slide ruler and my Venn diagram and do a rational analysis of whether I should shoot up or not. I mean, that's fine, except for that's not my experience of human life. I think I live, and I think most people live far more by instinct and by biology and by physicality than they do by reason. And the idea that people sit down and the junkie sits down and, crunches the equations before he decides whether to shoot up or not is utterly absurd.
Well, no. What's utterly absurd is that he doesn't do it.
No. Is it not more likely that we do the things we do because we are programmed by evolution and biology to behave that way?
Well, that would be true if we weren't rational animals. But unfortunately, we're not just animals who are driven by instinct. We have this little thing called reason that governs us. And Rand describes this very clearly.
I don't think reason does not govern me.
What is the difference between a tiger and a human? Okay, that's a stupid way of looking at it because I'm obviously going to...
Let me reiterate. Reason does not govern me.
Okay, but look at this. Okay, so a tiger. Can a tiger hang out in a meadow and do nothing until it starves to death?
Probably.
We haven't seen that. There's not a single example.
Okay, that doesn't mean it can't, though.
Well, no, it does mean that because based on the evidence today, we do not have an example of that.
We can infer it even though we have no examples of it.
Well, it's a fancy to infer it.
Okay.
What we have is examples of tigers repeatedly.
No tiger has ever starved to death. Is that what you're saying, sir?
No, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that no tiger lies down and merely starves to death. But a human absolutely can, and they have. Human being can sit down in the meadow, not pursue shelter, not pursue food, not pursue whatever he needs, water, and he will die. That's what will happen. A tiger cannot do that.
How many examples do we have of that, sir?
What?
A human being sitting in a meadow and starving himself till he dies.
We have many examples
give me
of
one,
human
please.
beings immolating. We have examples of people setting themselves on fire.
Okay.
Why is that? It's because Nietzsche was right about mankind to an extent. He's right. We long for something more. There is something more to man than there is to animal.
Is it possible that the person that set himself on fire had a biological drive towards death that was far stronger than his biological drive towards life and decided to make a political statement and it had nothing to do with reason?
Is it possible? Yes, I guess it's possible. Is it likely? No, I don't. And
I think it's just as likely that as him having sat down and done a cost-benefit analysis and drawn the Venn diagram and pulled out the slide rule and figured out that it was time to kill himself.
I'm not saying that act of self-immolation is irrational. Mm-hmm. I'm saying that it could be rational. Mm-hmm. It depends on whether he did that analysis and whether he was right.
Well, can I give you an example? I want to hear your take on this. So are you familiar with, so during the beginning of the Vietnam War, really before the United States built up its troop strength there in 65, there was a Buddhist monk who famously, in protest of the Diem government, which was the sort of Catholic U.S.-backed government in Vietnam that was at war with the Viet Cong at the time and with the NVA, this Buddhist monk burnt himself. It's a very famous picture. In fact, it's the cover of a Rage Against the Machine album, I believe. There's a picture of a Buddhist monk who covers himself in gas on the streets of Saigon and sets himself on fire and kills himself in protest, of the Diem government, the United States policy towards Vietnam, etc. So, is that rational? Is that instinctive? I don't think that man sat down and did a cost-benefit analysis before he did that. I think that he was driven by instinct and by spirituality to make that statement of killing himself by fire in the streets of Saigon in protest to the Diem government. What is first of all, you're familiar with that case? And if so, do you have any thoughts on it?
Yeah, that was the case I was referencing primarily, but also, I don't know if you know, but there's been several recent self-immolations around the world.
Well, that one was really famous, and everybody knows about it, and it's on the cover of the Rage Against the Machine album, so that's why I brought it up.
Yeah, of course. No, the answer is he may have been right to do that. He may have been wrong to do that. It depends. It depends on what the Venn diagram yields.
So you think it's a purely rational question, though, no matter what. It's not an instinctive question. It's not an emotional question.
I think if
it's not an artistic question, it's not a poetic question. It's not a question of spirituality. It's strictly a rational calculation. Is that what you're saying?
Okay, it's a weird way to phrase it for me to answer, because the things that you're saying, like spiritual things, I'm not denying that a person can have a very intense feeling of connection to something outside of our immediate existence. I'm not denying that. What I'm saying is that is a variable to be considered in the scheme of your rational analysis. And the question of whether that person should have immolated himself or not, and the answer is probably no, because what political question is worth that? The answer is probably no.
He did make the cover of a Rage Against the Machine album, and that's pretty hip.
Well, yeah, and hey, that's another thing that needs to be considered in objectively analyzing his sacrifice.
Right.
It does.
I mean, it's a fairly famous case.
To a Venn diagram. Let's say, for example, he was terminally ill and he had 10 days to live, and it was the question of stopping the invasion of Tibet by China was the most important thing, right? What was that? Was that the context, or was it?
No,
Vietnam?
he was. Well, okay. So
there were Tibetan monks that also.
But these guys were Vietnamese. This guy was a Vietnamese monk, and my understanding, and I'm sure there's historians and folks that know much more about this case than me, but my understanding is he killed himself in protest of the Diem regime, which was a Catholic regime that was in power and backed by the U.S. government during the early part of the United States war against the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong.
Yeah, I mean, look. So let's say I'm terminally ill, and I want to do something great for my people whom I love. That informs my decision. So, those are the variables that I take into account. How important is it for me to make this statement? And how important is my life in comparison, given that it's going to end in 10 days?
My question is this. Is there nothing but rational consideration there? Is there some
that is
other...
my argument. My argument is not that variables can't be based on something other than a rational consideration. But in order for you to make but yes, it has to be a rational consideration. More importantly, it has to be a rational consideration based on rational values. So you have to parse that out ahead of time. You have to determine what enhances and enriches your ultimate value, which is your life. People don't talk about this. This is the important thing. There's nuance here. Your life is the thing that enables you to have any values at all. If you act in a way that is not consistent with promoting or protecting your life, that's how you know you're being irrational.
Haven't you ever stuck your tongue out at the mirror, Boris?
Yes.
Okay. That's irrational, right?
Not necessarily. It depends. It depends on what your values are.
It's just funny. Let me just say this. I'm listening to what you're saying, and of course, I've heard this argument from you. You know, this is not our first rodeo, obviously.
Correct.
So we've heard each other's spiel on this a lot of times, and I just can't even imagine a thought process more foreign to me than what you seem to be describing and how these decisions are made. Because for me, these decisions are made automatically, intuitively, instinctively, deep within the mind. Not, reason doesn't even come into it until after the decision has been made on a fundamentally physical level for me to do this or that or the other. So as I listen to you say this, and I've listened to you say it many times, it's just like it's another universe to me.
But it's also, and that makes total sense to me, because it's not a natural process. It's not. A human being can't sit down in the meadow and starve to death intentionally.
And a human being can also live by instinct and intuition.
He can choose to do that too. He can choose to
successfully.
Do that. I don't know. I don't think it is possible to live instinctually successfully, because in order for you to be able to make the claim that something is successful, it has to be a communicable claim. It has to be coherent. In order for any claim to be coherent, it has to be rational.
Nothing can be real. Nothing can be real unless I can reduce it to language and equations. Yes. Okay. I don't agree with that.
Well, I don't know that I'm saying that nothing can be real. What I'm saying is that
nothing can be nothing. Let me rephrase it. Nothing can be significant if I can't reduce it to linguistics and a rational argument. I disagree with that.
I didn't say that either, though. It's not significant.
That seems to be what you're saying.
Nothing can be a valid guide to human action unless it's rational.
I disagree.
Because it has to be coherent.
Instinct.
Otherwise, it's not a guide of any kind.
Instinct is a valid guide to human action. Emotion is a valid guide to human action. Reason is a valid guide to human action.
Unfortunately,
biology is a valid guide to human action. There's many valid guides to human action. Reason is not the only one.
But unfortunately, you run into the argument that I just made. We have no instances of tigers sitting down and starving to death voluntarily by not doing the things that they need to do instinctively.
Okay. The fact
they
that
go out and they will fight to the last moment to survive, however they can.
And many humans will do exactly as tigers do and never sit down in a meadow and starve themselves to death. In fact, the example of a human being sitting down in a meadow and starving himself to death for some whatever, cost-benefit analysis he's done are fairly rare. In fact, I'm not even aware of one, and I've asked you to cite me to one example of it, and you cannot. So,
I brought in a more extreme example of self-immolation.
Okay.
Where do you see tigers self-immolating? It doesn't happen.
What does that prove that tiger's instinct is any more or less valuable than a person sitting down with a slide ruler and reasoning?
Self-immolate based on instinct. A person self-immolates based on their analysis or mental illness. I don't know, but that's what.
Some people self-immolate for spiritual reasons. Some people self-immolate for sexual reasons. Some people self-immolate for reasons of temperament, depression, etc. There's all kinds of but-for causes for self-immolation. I mean, yes, Catholics used to whip themselves with the cat o' nine tails on the back. Okay, that was self-immolation.
How many tigers are you familiar with that have self-immolated for any reason? The fact that you're saying that humans are capable of self-immolating for all of these different reasons caters to my
for reasons, for emotions, for instinct, for biology. I'm not saying it's just reasons. I'm saying that people self-immolate for there's a variety of causes for this behavior, one of which may perhaps be reason, but there are other causes for this behavior that you're talking about.
But see, unlike the person who self-immolated, we have the ability to look at the situation objectively. We don't know what his state of mind was. I don't know whether that decision could be classified as rational or just a drive towards the conclusion of his esoteric belief system. I don't know. My feeling is that it was irrational. It was wrong for him to do that. Objectively, it was wrong. I don't have all the facts. I don't know. I don't know the internal workings of his mind. What I'm saying to you is we have zero examples of tigers doing it. Only humans are able to sit down in the meadow and starve to death or self-immolate or do any of the things, self-destructive things that humans are capable of doing. Why do they do them? They either do them for two reasons. Either they're mentally ill and they've misconceived the effect of their actions. They have not fully assessed them in the context of their ultimate value, their life. Or two, they're doing it rationally, i.e. they've assessed the circumstance in the context of their ultimate value, and they've determined this is the appropriate course of action for them. Ayn Rand,
or when they were born, their human genome contained a set of data which predisposed them to this sort of behavior, and that finally broke through and took over and resulted in the behavior that we're discussing.
Correct.
Okay, but that has nothing to do with reason.
No, but you can.
That is a communication from one generation to another that has nothing to do with reason and is utterly coherent, and you must agree.
No, it's not coherent.
It's not coherent. You don't think that you can be
We're identifying a physical defect.
You are saying that you can't be genetically predisposed to certain behaviors strictly through the passing on of the genes in the historical progression of the human genome.
What I'm saying is whether or not you're predisposed in that way, you still have the responsibility to act rationally for your own life. And if you don't, then you are behaving improperly, incorrectly, and people can objectively point that out. We can say that. And moreover, and more importantly, we can use you as an example for how we ought to live or not live our lives.
I think you're fetishizing reason.
That's fair. That's a good point to end, I think. Okay. All right. So, peace out, everybody.
Wait till you hear my song. I guess you may have already heard my song.
It'll certainly be
our song. I'm sorry. Boris wrote the lyrics and I wrote the music, but I think it was successful.
Heck yeah. All right. To be continued.
To be continued. And I love Boris, despite the sometimes we get a little heated, but it's all in good fun. All in good fun.
Baby.
Part and parcel.